Hi everybody, it's week 8, and that means really that we're about officially halfway through the semester. So along those lines, what I would like to do is just remind everybody that you should be keeping track of your grades using the My Grades tab on the Blackboard site, and that allows you to look at your progress to date. It is everybody's individual responsibility to be doing that, but please also make sure that you notify me if you have questions or problems with the grades that you see. And I'm always happy to communicate about that with any student. So anyway, we're on week 8, and this is a little bit of a diversion. We're going to talk about something called public value and the strategic triangle. And this idea of the strategic triangle comes from a scholar from Harvard named Mark Moore. And I gave you some readings of Mark Moore's to look at this week, and then we're going to have an exercise that involves using his strategic triangle. And I also want to alert you that if you looked ahead on the assignments tab, which is available to you, you will note that our second short analysis paper is going to be doing an analysis using this very idea of the strategic triangle. So we'll do a little bit of exercise in the discussion this week, and then in a couple of weeks we'll have that second short analysis paper where you're going to be able to use it again. So let me get right into that. Well, first of all, this is where we're at right now. We've talked about mandates, as you recall, way back in the first week or so, and that those are the things that the organization must do. And these are either formal or informal, as you recall. Next, you remember we talked about stakeholders, and those are the people and organizations with a claim on our organization. And then we looked at how the internal and external environments affect the organization. And as you recall, we used the vehicle of the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and challenges exercise to examine the environment. We looked at and designed a mission statement for a local nonprofit, as you recall. And then just this past week, we talked about combining all that knowledge into putting together interview questions for your term project. And so we're really actually making really good progress. And I think it's starting to come together, and you're seeing how all these things fit together. And I also gave you some different ways of looking at strategic planning, because the Bryson text isn't, it's one way of looking at strategic planning, but there are other ways. And if you remember the videos by Jen Lockman that I gave you to look at. And this week I'm kind of continuing in that vein, looking at this idea by Mark Moore called the strategic triangle. So first of all, for this week, here's the readings that I want you to look at. I want you to look at Bryson page 44 and 45, which is just simply Bryson's 10-step process. We're going to be using that partially in the discussion. And then please look at chapter 9, especially about the first say 6 pages or so. And what Bryson goes into there is actually implementing plans that allow you to create what Mark Moore calls value. So public value. So the articles I gave you to read, there's 3 articles, and you'll note there that I only want you to read specific pages. There's this article called Managing for Value by Mark Moore. I just want you to read pages 196 through 202. The article called Creating Public Value Through State Art Agencies. Read the introduction and pages 9 through 18. And then on Creating Public Value, I want you to read pages 1 through 10. And so what we're going to do in the discussion is we're going to apply this like I always have you do to an actual organization. And the organization is the Omaha Police Department. And you see I put the link right there. So let me get into this idea of the strategic triangle. Okay, so First of all, it's really necessary for us to separate some differences, between the private sector, that is the for-profit sector, and the public sector. And this class is geared towards nonprofit and governmental organizations, that is, organizations in the public sector. And so what I want to just throw out a few things that Moore talks about in this article, this 2000 article, along the lines of what is the goal of the organization, what are the principal sources of revenue, how does the organization measure performance, and what is the key calculation that the organization is constantly making. So in terms of the goal, of course we know in the for-profit sector, in the corporate sector, especially in an organization that's traded, the idea is to enhance shareholder wealth, to enhance shareholder value. If I own stock in Berkshire Hathaway, I am always interested in Warren Buffett increasing my shareholder wealth. But even if it's not a corporate entity, it could be a private company. I may own my own construction company, and my goal is to make a profit. I'm not in the construction industry with my own company to lose money. I mean, I certainly might do that, but over time, I want to have a profit. But in the public sector, the goal is to achieve some kind of social mission. And if we're talking about government or nonprofit, there is some social mission, and you must achieve that mission. And along the lines of strategic planning, how do you know what that mission is unless you've really planned for it? And then let's talk about the principal source of revenue. Well, of course, in the business sector, whether it's a corporate type of business or a privately owned business, your revenue is earned by the sale of your products or the services that you perform for your customers. You're obviously not going to earn revenue if you don't sell your product. You may not earn money if your product is inferior, for example. No one's going to buy your product, and you won't get revenue. The principal source of revenue in the public sector, on the other hand, is, in the case of the nonprofit, is charitable contributions, usually, or in the case of governmental organizations, it's tax appropriations. That doesn't make it free money. It has to be accounted for, but it is the principal source of revenue. Third, when we look at measures of performance, so what do you look at in the private sector? Typically, you're looking at the financial bottom line or increased equity value. If I own my own construction company, I am looking to constantly be increasing equity. Now, I might take some of that equity actually, and I might do things like buy new equipment. I may hire additional crews for my construction company, but I'm constantly looking to increase that equity or to increase profit. In the public sector, what we're looking for as a measure of performance typically might be efficiency and effectiveness in achieving our mission. So again, let's take the hypothetical example of if I had a food bank. How would I measure my performance? I might be looking at some typical measure like cost per meal provided. If I had a way of knowing that, if I could provide a family of 4, say 20 meals for a week based on the grocery content that I give them, how much is that costing me? Based on the contributions I get, based on my own operating expenses, I'm looking for efficiency in that mission that I'm performing, right? So there are measures of performance in both the for-profit and the public sector. And then finally, the key calculation that a manager is always making. In the for-profit sector, what you're always looking to do is to find and exploit a distinctive competence of your firm by positioning it in the market. So you're looking for market share, right? I mean, if you are selling automobiles, if you're Chevy and you're making the Chevy Volt, you have a distinctive competence of that electric vehicle. You might be competing with the Leaf, for example. You might be competing with hybrid cars like the Prius, but you're looking for market share and a distinctive competence. Again, if I have my construction company, I may have some kind of specialty construction I do. Say I put on slate roofs in high-end houses. So I'm looking for that distinctive competence that I'm recognized for and market share. Well, in the public sector, you're always looking for better ways to achieve your missions. And your competency may or may not be distinctive, but you're looking for better ways to achieve that mission that you've been given, or your mandates that you know you have. So what Mark Moore came up with is this thing called the strategic triangle. And when he wrote this in 1995, he wrote this book called Creating Public Value way back in 1995. So this book is, 21 years old. What he was talking about, he was directing this book at public managers, at people who manage in the public sector. He was instructing these managers on how to create public value. And so what he said was public value looked something like a triangle. So I have these three interlocking circles that roughly resemble a triangle. And so the triangle, ultimately what you're trying to do is create something called public value. So what is this public value? Well, he said there were two things that fed into public value to create it. He said there was capacity, and then there was legitimacy and support. Well, what are these things? And so over the next 3 slides, let me describe what Mark Moore was talking about when he talks about capacity, legitimacy and support, and public value. So first of all, capacity. That is your organization structured to meet its mission, whatever its mission is? Again, if we have this food bank, do I have the capacity to be able to provide the mission that my board has given me to meet with my food bank? So what are some of the elements of capacity? Well, they could be skilled personnel. They could be my budget and my ability to manage my budget. They could be facilities. You might think of other things in this hypothetical food bank. We may have vehicles that we deliver meals in. We may have contracts. That could be a capacity that we have. We may have volunteers that work in our organization. And so all these things are measures of internal capacity to do the mission. And you can probably think of other things that are part and parcel of capacity. And so the question you could ask is, does the capacity equation change based on whether you're talking about a government or a nonprofit agency? Do you have different ways of looking at the budget, for example? How about your facilities? In the government, you may not even actually own your facility. Your organization might not. It might be owned by some other government entity. So there are differences in the elements of capacity. And so what Mark Moore says that a manager has to do down here, what the manager must do is manage downwards towards operational capacity and understand internal customers. That would be basically the people that work for you, or it might be your bosses, say your board of directors, and it might be your volunteers, for example, in the case of a nonprofit. So what the manager has to do is manage this capacity, this internal capacity. And then he talks about legitimacy and support, and this is very important in the public sector. So what are some elements of legitimacy and support? Well, first of all, there's the authorizing environment. That sounds like something we talked about, actually called mandates. The authorizing environment is, for example, the law that sets up that organization if it's a government organization. Your job is to provide issue driver's licenses to people. And there's a law that says how you're going to do it. So there's some authorization that makes your organization legitimate. But also, there's this idea of the public's view of the organization. If the public thinks you're not legitimate, then the question is, are you legitimate? And you have to think about that for a bit. I mean, if the public says, I'm just not going to go to the DMV, I'm not going to get a driver's license, well, they could probably do that, but the police would ticket you. You might get thrown in jail for driving without a license. But the public's view of your organization does add or detract from your legitimacy. And you can probably think of others. And again, does the legitimacy equation change based on whether you're talking about a government organization or a nonprofit agency? And so in this case, what Mark Moore says is that the manager must manage upward towards political expectations. So a lot of people see that as a bad word, but there are political expectations of your organization. And you have to understand that your customers include political authorities and other key stakeholders. So again, your legitimacy points back to your stakeholders. So you can kind of start to see how these things work together. And then finally, Moore is talking about achieving this substance of public value. So what are some elements of public value? Well, you might be delivering demanded services in a cost-effective manner. That increases your value, your public value. By delivering the services that you're mandated to deliver, but you do it in a more cost-effective way. You may be delivering services in a more equitable manner than you had in the past. And again, you can probably think of others. So there's this idea in public administration and in nonprofit, when we deliver our services and products, we have to balance some of these values, right? We have to balance efficiency and effectiveness with equity. And how do they work together, and how do they conflict with each other? And again, I ask this question: does the value equation change based on whether we're talking about a government or a nonprofit agency? So in this case, what the manager has to do is manage outwards towards value and effectiveness of public programs. So the manager actually has to understand, as a manager, how they are creating public value. They have to understand sometimes that clients are conceptual customers. So what do I mean by that? So again, in my food bank example, if my organization provides food, say bags of groceries to people who need food, those clients are my customers, but in a sense they're conceptual customers. They're not, they're not paying for that. And so they're not customers in the sense of a for-profit business, but these conceptual customers could also include elected officials and citizens who might have things to say or might have judgments about our organization. So here is Bryson's 10-step strategic planning process, and this again is on about page 44 of your book. So what I'd like you to do, and again this isn't easy to see on this slide, but you have your book. I'd like you to go back and look at this 10-step process in the book, and I'd like you to think about how these notions of capacity, legitimacy, and public value for more, how do they relate to Bryson's 10 steps? Well, so a little hint, just like always, and I've mentioned this, everything that I give you in class is supposed to work together. You're not going to learn everything from this lecture or any of my lectures. The readings also supplement the lecture supplements the readings. As you read more, think about the things he's talking about when he talks about his ideas of capacity, legitimacy, and value, and then try to relate it to these things that Bryson is talking about. And the reason I do that is because that's what we're going to talk about in the discussion board. But before I get there, as you're reading these and as you're considering that, think about these kinds of things. Who defines public value? I mean, if I say I want to create public value, well, who is the person defining public value? And then, do cost effectiveness, efficiency and production, democracy and equity conflict, or do they work together? Is public value a perception? Is it just something we feel, or can we actually measure it? Does public value differ depending on whether we're talking about a government or a nonprofit organization? And how does the organization plan to deliver public value? And then finally, what is meant by capacity and what is meant by legitimacy? So think through these questions as you're doing the reading. Sorry, I flipped the slide. What I want you to do first is to compare Moore's concept of public value, legitimacy and capacity with Brysons 10-step model. And so what I want you to do, I want you to write to this question. What portions and steps of the Bryson model address public value? Which steps address legitimacy and which address capacity? And then second, what I want you to do, I want you to go to this website for the Omaha Police Department and read through that website. Like always, the reason I point you to these websites is to be able to start making judgments on public and nonprofit organizations. After you've digested the police department website, I'd like you to do this. I'd like you to write a 2 to 3 sentence statement that describes the public value produced by the department. So, you know, you might have a sentence that says the public value produced by the police department is, and describe that in 2 or 3 or 4 sentences. And then I'd like you to name at least 2 elements of capacity and then justify each of those, and 2 elements of legitimacy and justify each of those with a statement. So that's it for our discussion board. And again, I will say in a couple weeks, towards the end of October, is your second short analysis paper. And again, it is using this very concept, the strategic triangle, to analyze another organization. So that's it for this week. Please do make sure to let me know if you have questions or concerns. I always like to answer those. Thanks very much.